close your eyes if you like, or simply let your gaze grow soft and unfocused, resting gently on whatever lies before you. There is nowhere you need to be right now. There is nothing you need to do. The day is finished, and whatever it carried, its noise, its demands, its small victories and little worries, all of it is slowly, gently drifting away, carrying across the cold air. It was the night that became known in French history as the Sun of Austerlitz, though the sun would not rise until morning. Napoleon himself was apparently genuinely moved by this spontaneous demonstration. He later said it was one of the finest moments he had known. The battle the next morning began before the mist had fully lifted. The Allied forces attacked on the right flank, as Napoleon had anticipated. As they did so, weakening their center, he launched his main attack directly at the now exposed Allied center, hitting it with concentrated force. The center collapsed. The Allied army was split in two. For the Allied forces on the low ground, south of a prominent feature called the Pratzen Heights, the situation became very difficult. They were cut off, pressed from multiple sides, many of them trying to cross frozen ponds to escape. The ice gave way in places, and men and horses and artillery pieces went through. By the early afternoon, the battle was over. The Allied army had been broken. The Russian Tsar Alexander, who had been present on the field, rode away in tears. The Austrian emperor asked for an armistice immediately. Napoleon rode through the wreckage of the battlefield that evening, through the smoke and the cold and the sounds that battlefields always carried in those days. He passed among the wounded, French and Allied alike, speaking to men, attending to individual moments of human suffering with a directness that people remembered. He was not a cold man in those moments, whatever else he might have been. The Treaty of Pressburg was signed on December 26, 1805. Austria ceded significant territories. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient medieval structure that had nominally organized Central Europe for 1,000 years, was effectively finished. It would be formally dissolved the following year. Napoleon reorganized a large portion of Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, a group of German states under French protection. The map of Europe had been redrawn. Let us sit with this moment of triumph for a quiet while. The world outside is dark and still, and whatever sounds you hear are the ordinary sounds of night. Nothing that asks anything of you, nothing that requires any response. The story is continuing to flow, gently, around you. Austerlitz was, in many respects, the peak, the single clearest demonstration of Napoleon's particular genius for war. It combined his reading of the terrain, his intuition about his opponent's thinking, his logistical planning, his ability to time movements with precision, and his personal authority over his men into a single, coherent operation that achieved exactly what he intended. It was, as a piece of military work, as close to perfect as such things ever come. But peaks, as any mountain climber knows, are followed by descents. Not immediately, not dramatically, not all at once. But the summit had been reached, and the path from there would, gradually and with many pauses and unexpected turns, lead downward. We are not there yet. There are still many years of the story to walk through, many quiet evenings in palaces and camps, many decisions made and unmade, many miles traveled across the wide face of Europe. Let us continue unhurriedly, along the thread. Part 9. The Imperial Years. After Austerlitz, the years between 1806 and 1807 saw further French military success. Prussia, which had remained neutral during the 1805 campaign, was drawn into conflict in 1806 and was rapidly defeated in the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt in October of that year. The Prussian army, which had been the most feared military force in Europe for a generation, was dismantled within weeks. Frederick the Great, Prussia's legendary king who had built that army, had died 20 years earlier, and his successors had not been able to maintain the same standard. Berlin fell to French forces. Then it was Russia's turn to face the French army in the field. The campaigns of 1806 and 1807 in Poland and East Prussia were hard. The terrain was flat and muddy, the weather harsh, the supply lines stretched. But they culminated in June of 1807 at the Battle of Friedland, where Russian forces were decisively defeated near the Alais River. The aftermath of Friedland led to one of the most remarkable diplomatic encounters of the era. The Russian Tsar Alexander I and Napoleon met on a raft moored in the middle of the Niemen River at a place called Tilsit in July of 1807. The two emperors spoke privately for over 2 hours, without witnesses, and then emerged to announce the terms of what would become the Treaty of Tilsit. The meeting on the raft at Tilsit has a certain dreamlike quality to it. Two of the most powerful men in the world, floating on a river between their two armies, talking privately in the middle of the water where no one could overhear. What exactly was said, what promises were made, and what reservations were harbored is not entirely known. What emerged was a treaty that divided Europe into spheres of influence: France in the west, Russia in the east, and an agreement that Russia would join the continental system, Napoleon's grand economic strategy for strangling Britain by blocking it from European trade. Tsar Alexander was charming and educated, and Napoleon was somewhat captivated by him. He found him genuinely interesting, genuinely imperial in the best sense, and he believed for a time that a real Franco-Russian partnership was possible. He was wrong about this, but it was an understandable mistake. Alexander was himself a complicated man, intelligent, spiritual, full of contradictions, and his warmth at Tilsit was real, even if the long-term alignment of Russian interests with France was always going to be limited. After Tilsit, at the age of 37, Napoleon stood at the absolute apex of European power. He was Emperor of the French, King of Italy. He had made himself that in 1805, and Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine. His brother Joseph was King of Naples. His brother Louis was King of Holland. His brother Jerome was King of Westphalia. His stepson Eugène de Beauharnais governed Italy as his viceroy. France and its satellite states controlled most of Western and Central Europe. The only major powers that remained outside his orbit were Britain, which was protected by its navy and its island geography, Russia, which was formally allied with him, but maintaining a certain careful independence, and the Ottoman Empire, far to the east. Even Prussia and Austria remained in existence, but weakened and dependent, unable to act without French permission. It was an extraordinary situation, without much precedent in modern European history. Charlemagne perhaps had come close, and the comparison to Charlemagne was not accidental. Napoleon was aware of the historical resonance, and he cultivated it. The court life of the imperial years had a quality that is worth pausing to describe, because it was one of the notable creations of this period. a deliberately assembled tableau of grandeur and ceremony that drew on European royal traditions while also being distinctly new. The Tuileries Palace in Paris was the primary residence. It was a large, somewhat rambling building connected to the Louvre, set along the Seine with views over the river and the gardens to the west. Napoleon filled it with people, his marshals and their wives, his ministers and officials, the family members he had elevated to royal status, and who came and went with varying degrees of gratitude and competence, ambassadors from every court in Europe. The court was formal in its ceremonies, but also, by the standards of the old Bourbon court at Versailles, relatively businesslike. Napoleon himself was not a man who enjoyed pure ceremonial for its own sake. He endured the elaborate protocols that were necessary for the dignity of his position, but he preferred to be working. He held councils that ran for hours, reviewed documents and correspondence constantly, involved himself in decisions at every level of the imperial government. The hours were long, and the pace was relentless. He ate quickly, very quickly by all accounts, often finishing a meal in minutes, which was a source of some distress to his chefs, who had prepared elaborate dishes with great care. He slept relatively short hours, working before and after sleep, in ways that would have exhausted most people. He had an astonishing physical energy that for most of his prime years seemed inexhaustible. Josephine was his empress through the coronation and into the imperial years, and she fulfilled the ceremonial role with a natural grace that was one of her great qualities. She was charming and kind to the people she met, and she was beloved by many of the people of Paris in a way that was genuine. The Château de Malmaison, outside Paris, was her particular domain, a beautiful property where she cultivated an extraordinary garden that became one of the finest in France, full of rare plants from around the world, particularly noted for its roses. But there was a problem that weighed more heavily with each passing year. Josephine had not given Napoleon an heir. They had been married since 1796, and despite a marriage that had been, at various times, both passionate and painful, there had been no children. Napoleon had children by other women. He had a son, known as Alexander, by a Polish noblewoman, which seemed to confirm that the issue lay with Josephine rather than himself. The question of succession was not merely personal, it was political, dynastic. What was the point of an empire if there was no secure succession? What happened when the emperor died? The whole structure he had built could collapse into civil conflict if there was no legitimate heir. He thought about this for years. It caused him real pain, before finally making the decision he had been avoiding. In December of 1809, Napoleon and Josephine divorced. The decision was made in the French civil code terms, an annulment of the civil marriage, and it was presented as mutual, which it partly was, in the sense that Josephine understood and, in her dignified way, accepted the necessity. But it was also devastating to her and to him. When the divorce was formally announced, in a ceremony at the Tuileries attended by the whole court, both of them wept. This was real, not performance. He had loved her, and he was losing her, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether he loved her. She retired to Malmaison, kept her title of empress, was treated with continued generosity and respect. He visited her there occasionally after the divorce, unable to entirely separate himself from the years and the connection they represented. The new empress would be Marie-Louise of Austria, a princess, a Habsburg, from one of the oldest royal families in Europe. She was 18 years old when they married in 1810, Napoleon was 40. The marriage was a political one, straightforwardly, though it turned into something more. They got on reasonably well. She was affectionate and direct, and she gave him what he needed politically, a son. On March 20th, 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a boy. He was given the title King of Rome, as if born already designated for an imperial future. Napoleon was 41 years old. He had an heir. He stood over the cradle of this infant, this child who had been born with a title and a destiny already determined, this tiny creature who had no idea yet of any of it. And he felt what fathers always feel in such moments, the particular mixture of love and responsibility and hope and fear that belongs to parenthood. The child would be known by various names at different points in his short life, as Napoleon II, though he never actually reigned, as the Duke of Reichstadt in his later years in Vienna. He would not live long, dying of tuberculosis at the age of 21. But in 1811, in the cradle, he was simply a new baby, and his father was very happy to have him. Part 10. The Spanish Troubles. The years after Austerlitz and Tilsit should, perhaps, have been years of consolidation, of making firm and durable the extraordinary structure that had been built. And in some ways they were. But there was a problem, a growing and eventually catastrophic problem, that began in 1808 and would never fully be resolved. The problem was Spain. In 1808, Napoleon made a decision that he would later recognize as one of his most serious mistakes. The Spanish royal family was, by the early 19th century, deeply dysfunctional. The king, Charles IV, was weak and dominated by a favorite minister. His son Ferdinand was in open conflict with his own father. Napoleon saw an opportunity to replace the unstable Spanish regime with something more reliable, something more firmly within the French orbit. He lured both the Spanish king and the Spanish prince to Bayonne, in southwestern France, where he pressured them, with varying degrees of elegance, which is to say not much, to relinquish their claims to the Spanish throne. He then installed his brother Joseph, formerly King of Naples, as King of Spain. What happened next was something that Napoleon had not fully anticipated. The Spanish people, who had not been consulted about any of this, and who did not want a French king thrust upon them, rose in revolt. Not in an organized military way at first. The Spanish regular army was quickly defeated, but in the more diffuse, persistent, deeply frustrating form of guerrilla warfare. Small bands of fighters operating in the mountains and the remote countryside, attacking French supply lines, ambushing columns, disappearing into the terrain before larger forces could catch them, then reappearing somewhere else. The word guerrilla itself comes from this conflict. It means, in Spanish, little war. And the little war that Spain mounted against French occupation would continue for nearly 6 years, consuming enormous French resources in men and money and energy, creating a running wound in the side of the empire that never properly healed. Britain, understanding the strategic opportunity, sent an expeditionary force to the Iberian Peninsula under a general named Arthur Wellesley, who would later be known as the Duke of Wellington. He was an exceptionally able commander, and in the conditions of the Iberian Peninsula, with its difficult terrain and its local population actively assisting the British and hostile to the French, he managed to wage a war of steady attrition that the French were never able to resolve. Napoleon himself spent some time in Spain in the winter of 1808 to 1809, trying to stabilize the situation through his personal presence, which helped temporarily, but he could not stay. There were always demands elsewhere, and when he left, the situation gradually deteriorated again. The Peninsular War, as it is known in British history, was a long and wearing experience for everyone involved. For the French soldiers stationed there, it was years of hard campaigning in difficult country against an enemy that would not stand and fight conventionally. For the Spanish people, it was years of suffering, the violence of guerrilla war, the reprisals of French forces, the destruction of property, and the disruption of ordinary life. The painter Francisco Goya captured something of the horror of this period in his extraordinary series of etchings called The Disasters of War. Images of terrible violence and suffering that refuse to glorify or romanticize what war does to human beings. Goya lived through the Peninsular War in Madrid, and what he saw shaped him profoundly. Napoleon visited Spain, received reports from Spain, sent reinforcements and replacement commanders, made decisions about Spain from the palaces of Paris and later from campaign headquarters in other countries. But the problem never went away. It drained resources constantly, tied down hundreds of thousands of French soldiers, and created a constant background noise of failure and frustration in an empire that preferred to think of itself as invincible. Part 11. Thoughts and Administration in the Imperial Years. Even in the midst of wars and diplomatic complications, the administrative work of the empire continued, and it is worth pausing to appreciate this dimension of Napoleon's years and power, because it is often overshadowed by the military campaigns in popular accounts. The Napoleonic Code, as it came to be known, the comprehensive legal system that had been set in motion during the consulate, was implemented and refined throughout the empire and its satellite states. It was one of the most significant legal reforms in European history, and its legacy has genuinely lasted. The principles it established, the equality of citizens before the law, the importance of clear and written legal rules, the organization of property and inheritance on rational principles, were genuinely revolutionary in many of the territories where they were applied. Old feudal structures, arrangements of privilege and exclusion that had persisted for centuries, were swept away. The educational reforms also continued to develop. The lycée system created a network of secondary schools across France that provided a standardized, secular education, one of the building blocks of the modern French educational system that still exists today. Higher education was reorganized. The Grande École, the prestigious specialized higher education institutions that train France's professional elite, were reshaped and institutionalized in this period. Public works were another area of significant activity. New roads were built across France and across the empire, roads designed for military movement primarily, but which also served civilian commerce and communication. The roads of the Napoleonic era helped knit France together physically in ways that had lasting effects. Canals were dug, ports improved, public buildings constructed. The Arc de Triomphe, begun in 1806 to honor French military victories, and the column in the Place Vendôme, cast from the bronze of captured cannons, were among the physical monuments of this era. Paris itself was being transformed, slowly but surely. Napoleon had large ambitions for the city, dreaming of making it the most beautiful capital in the world. And while the full realization of those ambitions would have to wait for his nephew's reign, the groundwork was laid in this period. The the straightening and improving of streets, the construction of new bridges over the Seine, the planning of new public spaces. The imperial court, meanwhile, had developed its own rhythms and character. There was a large and increasingly elaborate system of ceremony, of formal visits and receptions and dinners, all of it organized with the efficiency of a military operation by the Grand Chamberlain and the relevant staff. Napoleon was not always comfortable with this. He preferred working, but he understood its importance for the imperial image, and he participated with whatever grace he could manage. He also, in these years, corresponded. He wrote an enormous amount of letters, tens of thousands of them over the course of his career, dictating to secretaries who worked in shifts to keep up with him. His correspondence covered everything: military dispositions and supply logistics, legal questions and administrative decisions, personal matters and political negotiations, instructions to his family members and their various kingdoms, responses to petitions from individual citizens. He read reports from across the empire and responded to them with a specificity that often surprised the recipients. He had an extraordinary eye for detail. He could find the single significant number buried in a long administrative report, could identify the inconsistency in a set of statistics that revealed something important. He was, in other words, not merely a military genius. He was also an administrator of unusual capacity, a builder of institutions, a creator of systems. This dimension of his work has perhaps not received enough attention compared to the battles, but it is arguably as important for understanding what he actually accomplished and what his lasting legacy has been. In the evenings, when the official business was done, and often it was never entirely done, just set aside temporarily, Napoleon could sometimes be found reading. He had been a voracious reader his whole life, and the habit never left him. He particularly loved history, as he always had, but also literature. He enjoyed the theater, admired Corneille and Racine, had strong opinions about what constituted good writing. He also read the novels of the emerging Romantic movement. Though he was often critical of them, he found excessive sentiment somewhat irritating, preferring clarity and directness. He played cards occasionally, a game called 21, roughly the ancestor of modern blackjack, and he was not always a good loser, according to accounts of those who played with him. He rode when he could, though his horsemanship was not elegant. He rode with a utilitarian directness, using horses as tools for getting from one place to another, rather than appreciating them as he might have appreciated a beautiful weapon or a fine piece of mathematics. He had a complicated relationship with music. He loved opera and went to the Paris Opera frequently, but he was also famously tone-deaf and could not carry a tune. He genuinely admired the effect that music created in other people without being able to experience it in the same way himself. He loved Paisiello and Cimarosa in particular, Italian composers of the generation just before his own. The physical landscape of Paris was present to him in a specific way. He was a man who had grown up near the sea, and the Seine was never quite the Mediterranean, but it was water, and he had always been drawn to water. He liked to look at the river, liked the way the light moved on it, liked the city's relationship to its river, the bridges, the quays, the movement of boats. These quieter moments, the evenings with books, the walks by the river, the games of cards, the visits to the theater, were as real as the grand ceremonies and the military campaigns. They were the texture of a life being lived, day by day, in all its ordinary and extraordinary dimensions. Part 12. Science and Culture. It is worth pausing, before we continue the main thread of the story, to appreciate something about the Napoleonic era that is sometimes overlooked. Its relationship to the extraordinary intellectual and cultural ferment of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Napoleon was not just a military commander and political ruler. He presided over a period of significant achievement in science, arts, and scholarship, and he personally engaged with the intellectual life of his time in ways that are genuinely interesting. His Egyptian expedition, with its commission of scholars and scientists, had already demonstrated this. The Description de l'Égypte, that multi-volume monument to systematic observation and recording, was one result. Another was the discovery, during that expedition, of the Rosetta Stone, the basalt slab inscribed in 3 scripts, including hieroglyphics and Greek, that would eventually, years after the expedition, provide the key to deciphering the ancient Egyptian writing system. The stone was found by a French engineer near the town of Rosetta, and its eventual decipherment by the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s was one of the great intellectual achievements of the era. Napoleon was elected to the Institut de France, the National Academy, as a member of the mathematics section, not as an honorary gesture, but as a genuine recognition of his mathematical abilities. He had maintained his connection to scientific matters throughout his career, and he genuinely enjoyed the company of scientists and scholars. He had long conversations with the mathematician and physicist Pierre-Simon Laplace, with the chemist Claude-Louis Berthollet, with the naturalist Georges Cuvier. He found their work interesting in its own right, not just as a cultural ornament to his reign. The early 19th century was a period of remarkable scientific progress. It was the era of Laplace's comprehensive mathematical treatment of celestial mechanics, of the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, who was guillotined in 1794, a loss that still resonated, of the early work on electricity by Volta and Galvani, of the beginning of what would eventually become modern geology. The world was being measured and understood in new ways, and France was at the center of much of this activity. The arts flourished as well, though not always in direct relationship to the imperial court.
The painting of Jacques-Louis David, the great neoclassical artist who became Napoleon's court painter, produced images that would define the visual iconography of the era. The monumental portraits, the coronation scene, the portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps on a rearing horse that became one of the most famous images of the period. David was a genuine artist, working with genuine skill, and his images of Napoleon were both genuine art and very effective propaganda. The novel was developing as a literary form across Europe in this period. Goethe in Germany, Jane Austen in England, Stendhal and Chateaubriand in France. Very different writers, but all of them working in the same broad cultural moment. All of them shaped in various ways by the extraordinary upheaval of the revolutionary and Napoleonic era. Beethoven, famously, had begun writing his Third Symphony with the intention of dedicating it to Napoleon as a hero of the revolutionary ideals, a man who seemed to embody the possibility of a new kind of greatness based on merit and heroic achievement rather than birth. When Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor, Beethoven was reportedly so outraged that he scratched out the dedication so violently that he tore through the title page. He renamed the symphony Eroica, heroic, and the dedication was removed. Whether or not this story is exactly true in all its details, It captures something real about the complicated relationship between Napoleone and the progressive ideals of the era. He had begun as a figure of revolutionary idealism and had become something more ambivalent, a man of genuine achievement, but also a man of imperial power, conquest, and control. Part 13. Russia. The decision to invade Russia in 1812 was the decision that changed everything.
It is impossible, looking back from our vantage point, not to see it as the beginning of the end. But that knowledge, that retrospective clarity, was not available to the people living through it. What they had was a set of pressures and calculations that, to the people making them, seemed to lead in a particular direction. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to blockade Britain economically by closing European ports to British goods, was the underlying cause. The theory was sound enough. Britain's economy depended heavily on trade, and if that trade could be cut off from European markets, Britain would be economically damaged enough to be brought to terms. The problem was that the system required essentially all of Europe to comply, and compliance was difficult to maintain. Russia had been complying imperfectly since the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. But by 1810, the Russian economy was suffering from the restrictions, and Tsar Alexander was coming under pressure from Russian nobles and merchants to relax them. He did so, essentially allowing British goods to enter Russia through various mechanisms. This violated the spirit of the Tilsit Agreement, as Napoleon saw it. There were other tensions between France and Russia as well, disagreements over Poland, over the Baltic region, over the broader question of who controlled what in Eastern Europe. The two empires had been drifting apart since Tilsit, and by 1811, war seemed increasingly likely to both sides. Napoleon assembled the largest army he had ever commanded, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 men, drawn from France and all its allied and satellite states. They gathered in Poland in the spring of 1812, a great concentrated mass of human beings and horses and artillery and supply wagons, facing east toward the enormous expanse of Russia. He had apparently hoped that the Russian army would stand and fight near the border, that a decisive battle would occur quickly, that a quick victory would force Alexander to the negotiating table. This was the pattern that had worked so well in all the previous campaigns: the rapid advance, the decisive engagement, the imposed peace. Russia did not cooperate with this plan. The Russian commanders, partly by design, partly by circumstance, retreated. They fell back and back, avoiding the decisive engagement, drawing the French army deeper into Russia. The summer was hot, and the land the army marched through had been stripped of food by the retreating Russians. Disease and straggling began to reduce the effective force even before major fighting occurred. Smolensk, an important Russian city, was taken in August after hard fighting. Still, the Russian army fell back. Napoleon pressed on. He could not stop, he felt. If he stopped now, he would have to winter in a hostile country with a supply situation that was already very difficult. The logic of the campaign drove him forward. The great battle that he had been seeking finally occurred at Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, on September 7th, 1812. It was an enormous engagement, perhaps the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, with massive casualties on both sides. The Russian army under Kutuzov fought with extraordinary determination, and the French army ground forward through terrible resistance. By the end of the day,
The French held the field, but the Russian army had not been destroyed. It had retreated in good order, still in existence, still capable of fighting. Napoleon had won the Battle of Borodino, in the sense that the French held the ground at the end, but it was not the decisive, war-ending victory he had needed. He did not commit his Imperial Guard, the elite reserve, to the battle when it might have made a difference, a hesitation that puzzled his commanders and was never entirely explained. 1 week after Borodino, French forces entered Moscow, the great city, the old spiritual capital of Russia, if not the current administrative one, since Peter the Great had moved the capital to St. Petersburg a century before, was essentially empty. Most of the population had fled, and then, on the night of their arrival, fires began. The fires of Moscow burned for days, destroying most of the city. Whether they were set deliberately by the Russians to deny the French the comfort and supplies of the city, or whether they began accidentally and spread, or some combination, has been debated ever since. The result was the same. The French army entered Moscow to find a city largely destroyed, with very little of the food and supplies they had hoped to find. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting the Tsar to send envoys proposing peace. None came. Alexander would not negotiate from a position that looked like defeat. The French army sat in the ruins of the burned city, the summer ending, the first cold of autumn beginning to be felt in the mornings. Finally, in mid-October, Napoleon made the decision to leave Moscow. The retreat had begun. The retreat from Moscow is one of the great catastrophes of military history, and it has been written about and depicted many times, in literature and in paintings that capture the terrible suffering of that long march westward through the Russian winter. We will not dwell long on the suffering. That is not the purpose of our gentle journey tonight. But we cannot simply skip over it entirely, because it was one of the defining experiences of this life, one of the events that reshaped everything that came after. The Russian winter arrived early and severely in 1812.
By the time the French army, already diminished and weakened, was moving back through the devastated landscape they had marched through on the way east, the temperature was dropping well below freezing. The soldiers were not properly equipped for the cold. The supply system had effectively collapsed. The Russian army under Kutuzov harassed the retreating column constantly, cutting off stragglers, attacking at vulnerable points. Men died of cold, of hunger, of exhaustion, of the continued Russian attacks. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November, with French engineers working in freezing water to build bridges under fire, was one of the extreme moments, the kind of scene that stays with those who survive it for the rest of their lives. Of the enormous army that had crossed into Russia in June, a fraction made it back to Poland. Estimates vary, but the losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of men dead or captured or simply disappeared. Napoleon left the army in December and made his way back to Paris as quickly as he could, traveling in a closed carriage across the frozen plains of Poland and Germany. He needed to be in Paris, to deal with the political consequences, to begin the process of rebuilding. There had been, while he was in Russia, a coup attempt in Paris. A general named Mallet had briefly managed to spread the false rumor that Napoleon was dead and attempted to take power. The attempt failed, but it revealed something uncomfortable. Without Napoleon, the imperial system had no clear mechanism for continuing. He arrived in Paris in mid-December of 1812, after an absence of over 6 months. The city was quiet, subdued.
The people knew by now the scale of what had happened in Russia. The confidence of the previous years was gone. Let us pause here, in the quietness of that December.
Let us rest in the stillness of a winter night, the way the cold settles over a city and muffles it, softens it, makes everything a little more internal, a little more reflective. The story is entering its later chapters now. There are still several more years to walk through, years that hold their own texture and character, their own quiet moments and their own larger dramas. But from Russia onward, the overall direction is different from what it had been before. The long arc is bending. Let your breathing be slow and even. Let the story settle around you, like the snow settles over a winter landscape. Quietly, steadily, covering everything in its soft and neutral way. There is nothing urgent. We have all the time we need. Part 14. The Long Retreat from Power. The years from 1813 to 1814 were years of fighting retreat, not just literally, though there was that, but in every sense. Napoleon worked with desperate energy to rebuild the army that had been destroyed in Russia, and to a remarkable degree, he succeeded in creating a new force from the limited resources available. Young men who would normally have been too young for military service were called up. Veterans who had been convalescing from earlier wounds returned to the ranks. New equipment was manufactured, with the urgency that only approaching catastrophe can create. The problem was that the catastrophe in Russia had changed the political calculation for everyone. The nations of Europe that had been defeated, occupied, or compelled to be French satellites over the previous decade looked at what had happened in Russia and made their own calculations. Prussia, which had been humiliated at Jena and forced into an uncomfortable alliance with France, broke that alliance in February of 1813 and joined the Russian side. Sweden, under its king, who happened to be a former French marshal named Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's own creations, also aligned against France.
Austria, despite being connected to Napoleon through his marriage to Marie-Louise, eventually joined the coalition against him as well. It was the coalition of essentially all of Europe's great powers against France. The scale of it meant that even Napoleon's military genius and the genuine fighting quality of the French army could not produce the decisive victories that might have changed the outcome. There were French victories in the campaign of 1813, several of them at various points through the spring and summer. Napoleon was still a remarkably effective commander, still capable of maneuver and surprise, still able to concentrate force at decisive points. But the coalition armies kept coming, kept being replaced, kept pressing. The sheer weight of numbers was too great. The decisive engagement came in October of 1813 at Leipzig, a massive 3-day battle that became known as the Battle of the Nations, because forces from so many different countries were present. French forces faced Austrians, Russians, Prussians, and Swedes simultaneously. The battle was a French defeat, a serious one. The French army retreated westward across Germany, back toward France, and as it went, the German and Italian satellite states that had formed the outer ring of the empire began to detach, reverting to their own management or joining the coalition. Napoleon crossed back into France in November of 1813 with an army considerably smaller than the one he had crossed out of France with.
The frontiers of France were now directly threatened for the first time since the Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s. The campaign of 1814, fought on French soil, was one that military historians have studied with considerable admiration. Facing coalition forces that vastly outnumbered him, Napoleon moved rapidly from point to point across the eastern French countryside, through the flat, cold winter landscape of Champagne, back toward the approaches of Paris. And he won engagements, striking at exposed parts of the coalition force before they could concentrate. He was fighting with a fraction of the resources he had commanded at his peak, and he was fighting on the soil of France itself, against armies that were now pressing toward Paris. The campaign of 1814 showed something important: the core qualities that had made Napoleon dangerous, the speed of movement, the eye for the decisive point, the ability to keep troops moving and fighting beyond what seemed reasonable, were still there. He was still, as a military commander, formidably talented. But the coalition did not need to defeat him militarily in these encounters. They simply needed to keep pressing, to keep their armies in the field, to move toward Paris, regardless of what was happening in the countryside to the east. And that is what they did. In the end, as Paris itself was threatened, and the French marshals began to communicate with coalition representatives about the terms of a possible peace, it became clear that the empire was ending. On March 30th, 1814, Allied forces entered Paris. The city fell without major fighting. The marshals had essentially decided that enough was enough. Napoleon, still in the field, was told that Paris had fallen. He wanted to keep fighting. His officers, exhausted and realistic, told him it was over. On April 6, 1814, in the palace at Fontainebleau, south of Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the throne of France. He had been emperor for just under 10 years. Part 15. Elba. The terms of the abdication were negotiated in the days that followed, and what emerged was something that, in retrospect, seems strange, almost gentle, compared to what might have been. The Allied powers, in the Treaty of Fontainebleau, gave Napoleon the island of Elba. Elba is a small island in the Tyrrhenian Sea, not far from the coast of Tuscany, separated from the Italian mainland by a narrow channel. It is a real island, not a tiny rock, about 8 miles across at its widest, with a small, permanent population engaged in iron mining, fishing, and farming. It has its own mountains, small ones, and its own olive groves and vineyards, and in the spring and summer it would be green and warm and reasonably pleasant. The treaty gave Napoleon sovereignty over Elba. He was to be Emperor of Elba, if such a title could be applied to something so small. He was to keep a small personal guard, a few hundred soldiers. He was to receive an annual payment from France, though this payment would not always arrive as promised. And he was to retire there, as a kind of gilded exile, removed from the stage of European affairs. The journey from Fontainebleau to the Mediterranean coast was long, and in places unpleasant. Royalist sentiment was running high in parts of southern France. The Bourbon monarchy was being restored, and there was hostility toward the man who had dominated France for so long. Napoleon traveled part of the way in disguise, sitting inside a closed carriage, not able to show himself. At one point, the carriage was mobbed by angry crowds, and he was frightened enough to ask to borrow an Allied officer's uniform, moving through a part of his former empire, hidden under the coat of an enemy. He arrived eventually at the Mediterranean coast, at Fréjus,
the same town from which he had departed for Egypt 15 years earlier. The sea was there, as it had always been. He boarded a British ship, the HMS Undaunted, and sailed for Elba. The British captain and crew treated him with courtesy, which he appreciated. He arrived at Elba in early May of 1814.
The island greeted him with some ceremony. He was, after all, their new sovereign, however they felt about the circumstances. There was a small crowd, local officials, a little of the formality that such occasions require. He looked at the small harbor town of Porto at the rocky hills above it, at the blue sea surrounding everything. And he began to think about what to do next. Because Napoleone could not simply rest. This was simply not in his nature. Even here, on this small island, with a tiny staff and a guard of several hundred men, and no army and no empire, and the expectation of the rest of Europe that he would stay put and cause no further trouble, even here, he set himself to organizing, improving, planning. He reorganized the small Elban administration with characteristic energy. He had a road built, a real road, properly engineered, connecting Porto to the other settlements on the island. He had iron ore from the mines properly managed and accounted for. He reviewed his guards' training. He visited every part of the island, looking at the land with the eye of someone who had spent decades thinking about terrain and resources and organization. He had a small residence, a modest house compared to what he had known, and he made it comfortable, filled it with books, organized it with the neatness that had always characterized his personal spaces. He had spent decades in palaces and field headquarters and grand residences, but he was not, at bottom, a man who needed grand surroundings. What he needed was mental engagement, and he was providing it for himself wherever he could find it. He also had visitors, occasional ones. His mother, Letizia, came to be with him, a comfort, her steady presence, her particular maternal solidity that had been constant through everything. His sister Pauline also came, the one among his siblings who was perhaps most genuinely fond of him, and she brought liveliness and social energy to the quiet island court. Marie-Louise did not come. She had taken the young King of Rome to Austria, into the care of her Habsburg family, and as the months went on, it became clear that she was not planning to join her husband in exile. The marriage, which had been political in its origins, did not survive the collapse of the empire. She would eventually take up with an Austrian count, though that story would unfold only later. Josephine, his first empress, died in the spring of 1814, just weeks after his arrival on Elba. She had never been in good health in her later years, and the upheaval of the end of the empire, the uncertainty and the emotional strain, had worn her down. She died at Malmaison, surrounded by the roses she had loved. Napoleone received the news on Elba, and by various accounts, shut himself in his room for several hours. Whatever their complicated history, she had been one of the great constants of his adult life, and she was gone. The months on Elba passed in their quiet way. Spring became summer, summer became autumn. The island was not unpleasant, but it was small, and Napoleone's mind was not a small thing. He was also listening. The mails on Elba were not perfectly censored, and information reached him through various channels. What he learned was deeply interesting. France was struggling. The restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, was not enormously popular. The imperial army veterans, the officers and soldiers who had fought under Napoleone for years, were being pushed to the margins, their pensions sometimes unpaid,
their pride wounded by the restoration of a regime that had been swept away in revolution. The returning Bourbon émigrés, many of them having spent 20 years abroad, were acting as though the revolution had never happened, as though they could simply pick up where their class had left off in 1789. The people of France were restless.
The particular quality of French political feeling, volatile, easily moved by symbols and words and gestures, was not settled around the Bourbon Restoration. It was waiting. Napoleon watched all of this, thought about it, calculated. He was 45 years old. He was vigorous and capable. The island was small. In February of 1815, he made his decision. With about 1,000 men, the nucleus of his guard that the treaty had permitted him to keep, and a small flotilla of ships, he slipped away from Elba at night. He landed on the southern coast of France on March 1st, 1815, near Caen. Part 16. The 100 Days. The march from the landing point on the Mediterranean coast to Paris is one of the great dramatic episodes of the era. The restored Bourbon government sent troops to stop him. The troops, when they came face to face with their former emperor, did not stop him. They joined him. There is a story, probably true in its essentials, though the exact words have been polished in the retelling, of the moment when a force of royal troops stood in the road near Grenoble, blocking the path, guns leveled. Napoleon dismounted from his horse, walked toward them alone, opened his greatcoat, and called out something along the lines of, "If any man wants to shoot his emperor, here I am." The soldiers hesitated, then lowered their weapons, then one by one joined him. Whether or not this scene occurred exactly as described, the overall pattern was real. Unit after unit of the royal army, as Napoleon moved north, defected to his side. The Bourbon regime melted away. King Louis XVIII left Paris hurriedly, heading toward the Belgian border. Napoleon entered Paris on March 20th, 1815. The 100 Days, the period of Napoleon's final reign, from March 20th to his second abdication on June 22nd, were characterized by a particular feverish quality, a sense of something happening very quickly, in circumstances that were fundamentally precarious. He tried to govern as though the empire had been restored on a stable basis, drafting a new, more liberal constitution, making reassuring speeches, trying to hold together the complex French political landscape. But the coalition powers of Europe had gathered at the Congress of Vienna, had been reorganizing Europe's map, when news of Napoleon's escape reached them, and they were not prepared to accept this development. Armies began mobilizing. The coalition powers declared Napoleon an outlaw. Not France, not the French people, but Napoleon personally, a man who had put himself beyond the law of nations. This was a new concept, and a significant one. The idea of the proscription of an individual leader, setting him apart from the nation he led, declaring war essentially on him rather than on his country. The campaign that followed was swift. Napoleon moved into Belgium with the French army in June, seeking to deal with the Allied forces before they could fully concentrate. He faced two armies, one Prussian under Blücher and one Anglo-Dutch under Wellington. His plan was to get between them, defeat them separately. He defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny on June 16th, drove them back, though he did not destroy them. The same day, to the northwest at a crossroads called Quatre Bras, the French were less successful against the Anglo-Dutch forces. Then, on June 18th, 1815, the final engagement. Waterloo.
The battlefield of Waterloo was a stretch of farmland south of Brussels, near a town called Waterloo, on a day of cloud and early morning rain that had left the fields muddy. Wellington had chosen his position carefully, as was his habit, a ridge, with fields and farm buildings that could serve as defensive anchors, stretching across the Brussels road. The battle began late in the morning, later than ideal, because Napoleon had waited for the ground to dry enough for his artillery to move properly. This delay would matter.
The French attacked repeatedly throughout the day, against Wellington's ridge, against the farmhouses that anchored the defensive line. Wellington's forces held, reinforced by the farmhouses' stubborn garrisons, by the ridge that meant French forces were always attacking uphill, by Wellington's own skill at placing men where they needed to be. The fighting was extremely hard. And then, in the late afternoon, the Prussians arrived. They had been beaten 2 days earlier at Ligny, but they had not been destroyed, and Blücher had driven them through the night and day to reach the battlefield. When their first formations began appearing on the eastern flank of the French army, the tactical situation changed. The final French assault by the Imperial Guard, the most elite troops of the army, thrown in as a last decisive stroke, was repulsed. When the Guard fell back, it was a signal that could not be ignored. The invincible troops had been beaten. The French army broke. The pursuit by the combined Allied and Prussian forces turned the retreat into a rout. Napoleon rode from the battlefield in the darkness, his army disintegrating around him. He was back in Paris within days, in the Tuileries, facing the reality of what had happened. He had lost, definitively, unmistakably. The coalition forces were advancing into France. The French political establishment, the parliament, the ministers, made clear that they would not support another campaign,